He was only hired to clean the office floors, but when a struggling single father secretly prepared a meal for a powerful millionaire CEO, no one expected it would change both of their lives forever. The building on Fifth Avenue stood like a shimmering blade of glass against the early morning sky, its steel ribs catching the rising light. Inside, silence lingered, broken only by the faint hum of air conditioning and the rhythmic sweep of a mop across polished marble. Ethan Cole bent over his work, his dark hair falling over his brow, sleeves rolled up on his uniform. He moved methodically, wiping away invisible smudges that no one else would notice. But he cared. Every corner had to shine, every surface had to look untouched. For him, this job wasn't just about cleanliness, it was survival. The paycheck meant food on the table, rent covered, a safe bed for his son Lucas. Lucas was the reason Ethan never slowed down. At just 8 years old, the boy already carried the quiet maturity of someone who had seen too much. He often sat at the corner table in the small apartment while his father scrubbed or ironed uniforms, sketching pictures with crayons, sometimes of superheroes, sometimes of their family. Ethan knew Lucas should have a mother's warmth, a softer hand guiding him, but fate had been cruel. 3 years earlier, cancer had taken his wife, and in one winter month, Ethan had gone from husband to widower, from partner to single parent. Cleaning office towers wasn't the future he had dreamed of, but it was what kept them afloat. That morning was heavier than usual. The company was preparing for a high-stakes meeting, and the CEO, Madison Pierce, was already known for her exacting standards. A woman of 35, she had built a reputation as both ruthless and visionary. Employees whispered about her sharp brown eyes that could cut through any excuse. Her blonde hair always pulled back with precision, her tailored blue suits that made her look untouchable. Few had ever seen her smile. To Ethan, she was more a legend than a person, an image that towered above him like the skyscraper itself. As he finished polishing the railing near the elevators, he noticed the echo of heels clicking on the marble floor. Madison entered, her stride confident, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. She glanced briefly at him, not unkindly, just as one might glance at the background of a painting. He lowered his eyes instinctively, focusing on his mop, but the faintest scent drifted through the air. Lemon cleaner mixing with something warm. He realized it was from the thermos he had tucked on the cart. Soup he had cooked before dawn, the only way to make sure Lucas would have something hearty for dinner when he got home from school. Madison paused ever so slightly before stepping into the elevator. The aroma was out of place in this sterile world of steel and glass. It smelled of kitchens, of families, of homes where children laughed and people lingered at tables. For a fraction of a second, her gaze shifted, softer than her usual polished armor. She didn't say anything, only nodded once and disappeared behind closing doors. But Ethan felt the weight of that moment, as if something had cracked in the carefully distant world between them. The day moved on, but the memory of that glance lingered in Ethan's mind. He didn't know why it mattered. Perhaps because it had been years since anyone of her world had looked at him as more than a uniform. Perhaps because in that pause he had sensed something unexpected. Not judgment, not disdain, but recognition, however fleeting. He packed away his cleaning supplies and wheeled the cart down the hall, unaware that the soup he had cooked, with its strange blend of spices, would soon cross the invisible lines between janitor and millionaire, between glass towers and kitchen, tables between survival and something resembling hope. That morning, he thought he was simply scrubbing marble and erasing stains. He didn't know he had already begun to rewrite the story of his life. The following day began much like any other, but there was a restlessness in Ethan that he couldn't shake. He awoke before dawn in their small apartment, the cracked window letting in the faint chill of the city. Lucas was still asleep on the couch bed, his sketchbook sprawled across his chest, the stub of a crayon still clutched in his hand. Ethan watched his son for a moment, feeling both pride and sorrow. Lucas dreamed in colors while Ethan lived in shades of gray. He pulled on his uniform, brushed his hair back with damp hands, and quietly set a pan on the stove. The aroma of simmering tomatoes and garlic filled the air as he stirred together the simplest ingredients he could afford. Cooking had been one of the few joys left to him since his wife passed, a habit that connected him to her memory and gave Lucas comfort. Today, though, Ethan added more care, more thought. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the way Madison had paused yesterday. as though something about his food had reached her through the sterile walls of her corporate kingdom. By the time the sun rose, Ethan had packed two small containers, one for Lucas's school lunch and one to take with him. He kissed his son's forehead, whispering a promise that he would be home before bedtime, and left for the tower. The building loomed against the sky, indifferent and enormous. But today, Ethan's footsteps carried an odd anticipation. When he entered, the lobby was alive with hurried staff and crisp-suited executives preparing for a presentation. Ethan kept to his corner, pushing his cart, but he noticed something unusual. Madison Pierce herself was seated near the far end, reviewing documents with a frown carved into her flawless features. It was rare to see her in the open lobby. She usually swept directly to her private office. Her assistants fluttered around her like anxious birds, but she barely acknowledged them. Ethan concentrated on polishing a brass handle, but his container of food sat on the cart, and soon the rich scent drifted through the air. He saw Madison's eyes flick upward, just as they had yesterday. She didn't speak, but when one of her assistants brought her a cup of coffee, she barely touched it, her attention subtly following the scent that didn't belong in her world of caffeine and fast-paced power lunches. Ethan felt his chest tighten. What was he doing bringing home-cooked meals into a place like this? It was foolish, yet there was pride too. Pride that something he had created with his hands, from almost nothing, could catch the notice of someone like her. When lunchtime came, he slipped quietly into the employee break room in the basement. It was fluorescent lit and lifeless, with vending machines humming in the corner. Ethan opened his container, the steam curling upward like a secret he shared with no one. He barely had a chance to take a bite before the door opened. To his shock, it was Madison. She hesitated, as though she had stepped into a world she was not meant to enter. Her suit was immaculate as always, but her expression betrayed a rare uncertainty. "I thought this was just for staff," Ethan said, his voice low, unsure if he should stand or hide his food. "It is," she replied simply, her eyes drifting to the container. "I was following a scent." The words sounded strange coming from her, almost vulnerable. She stepped closer. "What is that?" Ethan hesitated, then answered, "Just something I cooked at home. Tomato and garlic stew with a little rosemary. Nothing special." Madison's gaze sharpened. "It doesn't smell like nothing." She surprised him by pulling out the opposite chair and sitting down, folding her hands on the table. "May I?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "You want to try it?" She gave a faint nod, her usually commanding tone softened by curiosity. Ethan slid the container across the table, watching as she picked up his spoon. She tasted it slowly, her eyes closing for a moment, as if her entire world had paused. When she opened them again, there was no mask, no armor, just a flicker of something human and raw. "This," she said softly, "reminds me of when I was a child. My mother used to cook like this, before everything changed." The room was silent but heavy with meaning. Ethan had no idea what everything meant in her life, but he saw the truth. Beneath the millionaire CEO, there was a woman with memories, with losses, with a hunger that had nothing to do with money. Madison set the spoon down carefully, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. "You're not just a janitor, Mr. Cole." "Ethan Cole," he replied, his throat tight. "You're not just a janitor, Mr. Cole," she repeated, as though she needed him to believe it too. Ethan didn't know what to say. He only knew that something irreversible had shifted. In that sterile, forgotten break room, a wall had cracked open, and through it spilled the possibility of a story neither of them had expected to begin. Ethan could hardly sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Madison sitting across from him at that cheap break room table came flooding back. Her tailored navy suit so out of place under the buzzing fluorescent lights, her delicate fingers gripping his spoon, her face softening in a way that felt almost unreal. He kept replaying the way she had said his name, as though she had uncovered something hidden beneath the layers of his life. For years he had accepted invisibility as part of survival. Clean, sweep, empty trash, clock out, go home. But yesterday had broken that pattern. He lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if he had crossed a line, if tomorrow she would pretend none of it happened. The next morning, Lucas's cheerful chatter about a drawing project pulled Ethan back to earth. His son's joy was like oxygen, reminding him of why he endured the grind, why he kept moving forward despite exhaustion. Ethan packed Lucas's school bag, slipped a kiss on his son's hair, and promised, as always, that things would get better. Yet as he headed toward the towering glass building, an unease gnawed at him. He was stepping back into a world where he didn't belong, but now he wasn't sure if that was true anymore. When Ethan entered the building, he tried to keep his head down, but he noticed subtle changes. A few employees glanced his way with unusual interest, whispering as if they knew something he didn't. His stomach tightened. Then he caught sight of Madison striding through the lobby, her usual entourage trailing behind her. For a moment, her eyes flicked toward him, just for a second, but there was recognition there. Not the dismissive acknowledgement one might give to background staff, but something far heavier. She didn't slow her pace, but that brief look carried weight, as if they shared a secret. The morning passed in quiet tension until, near midday, Ethan was asked by a floor manager to bring supplies up to the executive level. He had never been summoned there before. The upper floor was pristine, almost intimidating, with tall glass walls and hushed conversations. He rolled his cart carefully, feeling the stares of men and women in sharp suits who clearly wondered what a janitor was doing in their rarefied space. Then Madison appeared in the corridor, speaking with two board members. She was composed, polished, the very picture of authority. Ethan kept his head lowered, but he could feel her glance sweep over him like a current of electricity. Once she finished her discussion, she walked toward him. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone formal but not cold. He looked up reluctantly. "Do you have a moment?" Every instinct told him to decline, to slip back into the safety of invisibility. But something in her gaze rooted him in place. "Of course," he managed. She gestured for him to follow, leading him into her private office. It was vast, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the skyline glittering like another world entirely. Ethan felt as though he had stepped into a realm where he didn't belong. Madison moved behind her desk but didn't sit. Instead, she studied him in silence, her brown eyes sharp yet softened by curiosity. "I don't often leave this office," she admitted, almost to herself. "Yesterday was unusual." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. "I didn't mean to overstep, it was just lunch." Her lips curved faintly, though not into a full smile. "It wasn't just lunch. You reminded me of something I had forgotten, a simpler time, a feeling I haven't had in years." She paused, folding her arms as though bracing herself. "Do you cook often?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Every day, for my son. It's one of the few things I can give him that feels whole. Food was always how my wife showed love. After she passed, I wanted to keep that alive." His voice caught slightly, but he forced himself to stay steady. Madison's expression shifted at his words, a flicker of empathy flashing across her features before her usual composure returned. "Your son?" she repeated softly. "How old is he?" "8. His name's Lucas." For a moment, silence filled the expansive office, broken only by the hum of the city outside. Then Madison took a step closer, her tone unusually gentle. "Mr. Cole, I want you to bring one of your meals to me tomorrow. Not here in the break room, to me." Ethan blinked, stunned. "You mean, for you to eat?" "Yes." She met his eyes directly, her voice carrying an authority that left no room for doubt. "I want to taste what you create, not out of curiosity anymore, but because I believe there is something extraordinary in what you do. Something this place, this life, has lost." Ethan's throat went dry. He wanted to argue, to say he was just a janitor, that this wasn't his world. But the words wouldn't come. All he could manage was a quiet, "I'll try." Madison studied him for another long moment, then gave a small, decisive nod. "Good. Tomorrow, then." When Ethan left her office, his hands were trembling. Down in the lobby, the world seemed unchanged. Executives rushing, assistants buzzing, guards watching. But for him, nothing was the same. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. Somehow he had been pulled into Madison Pierce's world, and he wasn't sure whether it would save him or destroy him. The night before, Ethan stood in his small kitchen, staring at the few ingredients he could afford. He wanted to create something worthy of the woman who had asked him directly, something that could carry the weight of memory and meaning without the flashiness of gourmet kitchens he had only seen on TV. He thought of Lucas asleep in the next room, his little body curled under the blanket, trusting his father to keep the world steady. Ethan whispered to himself, "This has to matter." He pulled out flour, chicken broth, garlic, herbs he had coaxed from a tiny windowsill garden, and a bag of carrots that were nearly at their end. With steady hands, he worked until midnight, shaping the meal with patience, as if every slice and stir was part of a prayer. It was humble but crafted with love, a rustic chicken stew with fresh baked bread, the kind his wife once made when their world had felt whole. Morning arrived heavy with nerves. As Ethan packed the food carefully into a worn container, he almost lost his resolve. Who was he to bring this to the desk of Madison Pierce, a woman who dined at places he couldn't even pronounce? But her words from the day before echoed in his mind. Something extraordinary in what you do. He clung to that fragile thread as he kissed Lucas goodbye and carried his small offering into the heart of wealth and glass and power. At noon, Madison's assistant appeared in the janitorial hallway, her heels clicking impatiently against the tile. "Mr. Cole, Ms. Pierce is waiting," she said, with a look that hovered between disbelief and suspicion. Ethan nodded silently and followed, clutching the bag like it held not just food but pieces of his soul. When he entered Madison's office, she was standing near the window, her blue suit a stark contrast against the golden sunlight streaming through the glass. The city behind her stretched endless, yet she turned as if the only thing that mattered was him. "You came," she said, her voice even, but her eyes betrayed curiosity, even anticipation. Ethan set the bag on the table, his hands trembling as he unpacked the meal. The aroma filled the pristine office, warm and inviting, utterly unlike the sterile scents of polished wood and expensive perfume that usually dominated the room. Madison stepped closer, inhaling, her composure flickering. "It smells like—" She stopped herself, then shook her head as if dismissing the thought. "Like home," Ethan finished softly. She looked at him, startled, but said nothing as he poured the stew into a bowl and placed the bread beside it. He had no silver serving trays, no elegant presentation, just a steaming bowl of food and the hope that it might bridge two worlds. She sat down, smoothing her skirt, and took the spoon in her hand. For a moment, she simply stared at the meal, as though confronting something far larger than a dish. Then she lifted the spoon to her lips. The moment it touched her tongue, her eyes widened and she exhaled slowly, her composure cracking. The spoon hovered in her hand as she looked at him, something raw and unguarded flashing in her gaze. "It's simple," she whispered, her voice quieter than he had ever heard. "But it's real. It's alive." She took another bite, then another, each one seeming to chip away at the icy armor she wore in boardrooms and investor calls. Her jaw tightened as though she were holding back emotions she didn't want him to see. Ethan stood there awkwardly, his heart pounding, not knowing whether to leave or stay. Madison finally set the spoon down and leaned back in her chair, her hand pressed lightly against her lips. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked quickly, forcing the tears away. "You have no idea," she murmured, "what this means. I haven't tasted anything like this since I was a child." The confession hung between them, startling them both. Ethan swallowed hard, his voice rough. "It's just food. I just cook for my son. That's all." "No," Madison said firmly, shaking her head. "It's not just food. You've managed to put feeling into it. That's something all the Michelin stars in this city can't buy." Silence fell again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, a moment that tied them together in ways neither fully understood. Madison finally straightened, her CEO mask slowly sliding back into place, but her eyes betrayed her, softer now, almost vulnerable. "You'll cook for me again," she said, not as a question but a command, though gentler than anything she had ever spoken to him before. "This cannot be the last time." Ethan's chest tightened. He nodded slowly, uncertain where this path would lead, but knowing there was no turning back. When he left her office, the scent of stew still lingered, mingling with the faint trace of her perfume. And though the building looked the same, for Ethan the world had shifted. A door had opened, one he never imagined he would step through. The following week at Pierce Enterprises felt strangely different for Ethan. The halls he had once moved through unnoticed now seemed charged with whispers. It began subtly. The assistant who used to hand him supplies without eye contact now lingered, glancing at him as though trying to solve a puzzle. Two executives passing by in the lobby lowered their voices, one of them tilting his head toward Ethan before they both smirked. It wasn't hostility, but it was attention, and Ethan was not used to being seen. He was a man who lived in the margins, invisible by necessity. Now invisibility seemed impossible. The reason was Madison Pierce. She had kept her word. Each afternoon around the same time, she would send for him. Sometimes she didn't even wait for her assistant. She would walk into the janitorial wing herself, her presence so startling in that bleak, bleach-scented corridor that the other workers froze mid-task. She never apologized or explained. She simply said, "Mr. Cole, bring what you've made," as though it were the most natural thing in the world. For Ethan, each encounter was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had to stretch his meager budget, scraping together ingredients with Lucas's help. Sometimes they experimented in their tiny kitchen. Lucas perched on a chair, his hands covered in flour as he giggled at his father's serious instructions. "We're cooking for the lady boss again?" he asked, pride lighting up his young face. Ethan would smile, ruffle his son's hair, and whisper, "Yes, for her." He never admitted how much the responsibility weighed on him, how desperately he wanted to deliver something meaningful each time. Madison received his food with a grace that startled him. She no longer treated it as novelty. She sat with it, savored it, asked questions, not just about the dish, but about how he thought of flavors, what inspired him. Ethan tried to deflect, embarrassed by the intimacy of the questions. But she pressed gently, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't told anyone since his wife died. About his grandmother's Sunday meals, about teaching Lucas to knead dough, about finding comfort in the rhythm of cooking when grief had hollowed him out. Madison listened without judgment, her eyes soft, her posture leaning closer each time. Yet outside the cocoon of her office, the rest of the company buzzed. Rumors spread fast in skyscrapers built on gossip. "Why is the CEO eating food from the janitor?" one manager muttered in the elevator. Another chimed in, "He's not even a chef. What's going on?" By the end of the week, the whispers turned into curious stares whenever Ethan entered the building with his worn lunch bag. He heard snippets. Personal project, charity case, something more. But he kept his head down, refusing to feed the speculation. Madison, however, didn't hide. One evening, after a long board meeting, she walked through the lobby with Ethan trailing behind, carrying the empty containers she had insisted he collect personally. The sight drew gasps. She ignored them all, her stride unbroken, her head high, while Ethan's cheeks burned with humiliation and something stranger, an ember of pride. Later that night, as Ethan scrubbed the marble floor of the executive wing, one of the junior associates stopped him. The young man leaned casually against the wall, his tone mocking but curious. "So, what's your secret, Cole? What exactly are you serving Ms. Pierce that has her calling for you every day?" Ethan paused, tightening his grip on the mop. His instinct was to stay silent, but instead he met the man's eyes. "Something you wouldn't understand," he said quietly, then went back to his work. The associate laughed, but the sound was hollow, and Ethan knew he had planted a seed. What he didn't know was that Madison herself was also battling whispers. The board members had questioned her during a dinner, one of them half-jokingly asking if she was starting a corporate kitchen. She had brushed it off, but inside she bristled. They would never understand what those meals meant to her. In the quiet of her office, spoon in hand, she wasn't the millionaire CEO. She was just Madison, a woman tasting comfort she hadn't known in years, a woman remembering what it felt like to be human instead of untouchable. As the week closed, Madison made a decision. She sent Ethan home with a folded envelope, her handwriting on the front. "Open it when you're alone," she told him. Ethan waited until Lucas was asleep, then sat at the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he unfolded the paper. It wasn't a check, as he half feared and half expected. It was an invitation. "Saturday, my home. Cook with me." The words were simple, but they left Ethan reeling. This wasn't just about food anymore. This was a door into her world, and he had no idea if he was ready to step through. Saturday came wrapped in a thin veil of nerves. Ethan spent the entire morning pacing the cramped apartment, checking his reflection in the bathroom mirror, though he owned only two shirts that could pass as decent. Lucas perched on the couch, kicking his feet, asking question after question. "Are you cooking for the boss lady? Is she nice? Do I get to come? Ethan tried to keep his tone calm, explaining that this was something he had to do alone, but his heart pounded with every word. The invitation had felt unreal all week, but now it was tangible. Madison Pierce, the woman who commanded boardrooms, wanted him. Not his services, not his cleaning, but him in her home. When he finally left the apartment, the city felt louder than usual. Every car horn and vendor's shout amplifying his anxiety. He carried a cloth bag filled with ingredients he had scraped together from savings. Fresh herbs, a cut of chicken, and vegetables he knew he could turn into something warm and meaningful. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. He told himself that if this night was to mean anything, it would mean authenticity. Madison's home was nothing like the glass and steel fortress of her office tower. Nestled in a leafy corner of the city's wealthiest neighborhood, her townhouse glowed with a soft golden light. Ethan stood at the gate for a long moment, staring at the door, almost turning back. What business did a janitor have stepping into a millionaire sanctuary? But the door opened before he could retreat, and there she was. No blazer, no sharp heels, just Madison in a simple navy sweater and jeans. Her blonde hair was tied loosely, strands falling around her face. She smiled, not the practiced CEO smile, but something quieter, almost shy. "You came," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard. "You invited me," Ethan answered, holding up his bag as though it were proof he belonged. She stepped aside and he entered a world that was both intimidating and strangely warm. The townhouse was elegant without being sterile. Books lined the walls, photographs of her family were framed on shelves, and a grand piano sat in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the glow of lamps. The kitchen was vast, gleaming with marble counters and high-end appliances Ethan had only seen in magazines. He set his bag down carefully, suddenly self-conscious. Madison leaned against the counter, watching him. "This is where I burn toast," she said, her tone playful. "Teach me how not to." Her joke loosened the tension. Ethan pulled out the ingredients, explaining each choice as he worked. Madison listened, asking questions about spices and methods, her hands brushing against his as she passed him utensils. The intimacy was startling. This wasn't the detached CEO. This was a woman letting down her guard, showing curiosity and vulnerability. Ethan guided her through chopping onions, laughing when she winced at the sting in her eyes. And for a while it felt almost ordinary, as though they were two old friends cooking together rather than two people separated by an entire world. But beneath the laughter, there was gravity. Madison confessed between stirring and tasting that she hadn't had someone cook for her in years. "Everything in my life is catered," she said, her brown eyes fixed on the pan. "Meetings, dinners, events, it's all orchestrated. But this," she gestured at the sizzling skillet, "this feels real." Ethan didn't know how to answer. He only focused on the dish, pouring his care into every movement, knowing that food was the only language he could truly trust. When the meal was done, roasted chicken with lemon and herbs, vegetables glazed to perfection, he plated it carefully, his hands steady despite his racing heart. They sat at her dining table, candles flickering, the atmosphere more intimate than either had expected. Madison's first bite stopped her. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and when she opened them, there was something almost vulnerable in her gaze. "It's extraordinary," she whispered. "Do you know what you've done?" Ethan shook his head, his voice low. "I just cooked." "No," she said firmly. "You gave me something I didn't realize I was starving for." The words struck him harder than he could admit. For years, Ethan had been defined by absence, of his wife, of stability, of recognition. Yet here, in the home of a woman who had everything, he was the one providing what she lacked. He watched her savor each bite, and for the first time in years, pride bloomed in his chest. After dinner, they drifted into the living room. Madison sat at the piano, running her fingers over the keys without playing. "My mother used to play," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never learned." Ethan, surprising himself, pressed a single note, then another, a clumsy melody that made her laugh. For a moment, the silence between them felt charged, a delicate thread pulling them closer. When he finally stood to leave, Madison walked him to the door. She hesitated, then touched his arm, her eyes searching his. "Thank you, Ethan. Tonight, it meant more than you know." He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded and stepped into the night, the cool air filling his lungs. As he walked back through the quiet streets, one truth settled deep inside him. His world and hers were colliding, and neither of them would emerge unchanged. Monday morning arrived with a sharpness Ethan hadn't felt in years. The memory of Saturday lingered in his chest like a fire that refused to die down. The laughter in Madison's kitchen, the candlelight dinner, the unexpected tenderness of her gaze when she whispered that he had given her something she didn't even know she was starving for. He'd replayed it 100 times as he tried to sleep, only to wake with equal parts dread and hope. Because reality was already knocking, and reality never cared for candlelight or fragile threads of connection. When he arrived at the building to start his shift, the whispers started. Two junior associates stood by the elevator, one of them smirking. "That's him," the taller one said, not bothering to lower his voice. "The janitor who cooked for the boss." The other snorted. "What's she thinking? Entertaining a cleaner?" "It's pathetic." Ethan kept his head down, gripping the handle of his cart until his knuckles whitened. Shame and anger churned in his stomach, but he swallowed it. He couldn't afford to react. By mid-morning, the murmurs had spread. The office, usually indifferent to his presence, seemed suddenly hyper-aware of him. Executives stole glances, interns whispered behind coffee cups. Even the security guard, usually friendly, gave him a look that wasn't unkind but carried something new. Curiosity, pity, maybe even admiration. Ethan hated it all. He hadn't asked for this spotlight. All he had done was share a meal. But with Madison Pierce, nothing was ever just a meal. Madison herself appeared around noon, striding through the lobby in her blue suit, her confidence like armor. Her eyes caught his for the briefest moment, a flicker of warmth breaking through the polished exterior, but it vanished as quickly as it came. In front of her board members, she was all business, voice crisp, posture sharp. Ethan understood. She couldn't let the world see softness. Not here, not with him. Later that afternoon, while emptying trash bins in one of the conference rooms, Ethan overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two board members, both older men with expensive watches and smug expressions, were speaking in hushed but heated tones. "She's compromising the company's image," one said. "First the unorthodox decisions, now this nonsense with the janitor. If the press catches wind, investors will panic." The other nodded grimly. "We need to remind her that sentimentality has no place in leadership. She's losing perspective." Ethan's stomach tightened. It wasn't just gossip. It was a threat. Whatever had blossomed between them, fragile and new, was already under attack from forces far larger than either of them. He wanted to storm in, to defend her, to tell them they didn't know her heart. But he stayed hidden. Because what power did a janitor have against board members who controlled millions? That evening, when the building emptied and silence returned, Madison found him cleaning the marble floors of the lobby. She approached quietly, almost hesitant. For a long moment, she just watched him push the mop across the glossy surface, as though memorizing the image. Finally, she said softly, "They're talking, aren't they?" Ethan looked up, startled. "You know?" Her lips curved in a tired smile. "Of course I know. I always know. In my world, rumors move faster than truth." She sighed, sinking onto one of the leather benches. For the first time, she looked less like a millionaire CEO and more like a woman weighed down by expectations. "They think I'm reckless, that I'm letting, whatever this is, cloud my judgment." He set the mop aside, sitting a careful distance from her. "And do you think that?" She met his eyes then, her brown gaze searching his face. "No," she said firmly. "But what scares me is how much I don't care what they think when I'm with you. That's dangerous in my position." Ethan's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her not to worry, that he could disappear if it protected her, that he'd never forgive himself if her career suffered because of him. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he said, "Maybe what scares you is also what you need." The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, Madison reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. Just a fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through him. "Ethan," she whispered, "I don't know where this is going, but I know I don't want it to end here." At that moment, a sound broke the fragile bubble, the click of heels echoing across the marble. One of the senior board members had returned to collect something left in his office. His eyes landed on Madison and Ethan, their hands so close, their faces inches apart. His brows lifted in silent judgment, his lips tightening. Without a word, he walked past, but the damage was done. Madison pulled back instantly, her posture snapping back into CEO form. Her voice, when she spoke again, was brisk, professional. "We'll talk later," she said, standing. But her eyes lingered on Ethan's for a beat longer, filled with unspoken fear and longing, before she turned and walked away. Ethan sat there, the echo of her touch still burning on his skin. He knew what would come next. Pressure, scrutiny, perhaps even a battle neither of them was ready for. But as he picked up the mop again, one truth anchored him. No matter what storm was gathering, the connection between them had already taken root, and nothing could erase what they had begun. The boardroom was colder than Ethan had imagined, not because of the polished marble table or the gleaming glass walls, but because of the way every pair of eyes looked at him as though he were an intruder who had wandered into a place he didn't belong. He stood awkwardly near the door, his uniform still carrying faint traces of cleaning solution, his calloused hands betraying a life of labor. He had never dreamed of being in this room, much less summoned there. Yet here he was, because the whispers had grown too loud to ignore, and Madison had asked him, no, begged him, to be there when the board confronted her. At the head of the table sat Madison, flawless as always in her navy suit, her blonde hair tied neatly, but Ethan could see the tension in her posture, the exhaustion beneath her carefully drawn composure. The chair of the board, a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel, leaned forward. "Ms. Pierce," he began, his tone deliberately formal, "this company has weathered storms because of discipline and image. But lately, your judgment has been compromised. Entertaining rumors about a relationship with a janitor, allowing him access to spaces far beyond his station, it jeopardizes everything we've built." A murmur of agreement rippled around the table. Ethan's chest tightened. Every word was a knife, not just for him, but for her. Madison's jaw set, but before she could answer, Ethan surprised himself by stepping forward. His voice shook at first, but then steadied. "I didn't ask to be part of this," he said, his eyes moving across the room. "I didn't plan for any of it. I'm a single father trying to survive, trying to give my son a better life. I clean your offices because that's what I was hired to do. But one night I cooked a meal, not for recognition, not for advantage, just because I love it, because it's the one thing that reminds me of who I was before life became about surviving day to day." Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably, but the chair sneered. "This is irrelevant sentiment. This is precisely what proves she's lost perspective." Madison rose then, her voice clear and cutting through the tension. "No," she said firmly, "this proves I've gained perspective. For years, I've lived by your rules, by the sterile image of what a CEO should be. But that image is empty if it doesn't have humanity behind it. You talk about survival of the company. Ethan embodies survival. He embodies resilience, creativity, and integrity. And if you think his presence here weakens me, you're wrong. It strengthens me." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Madison's eyes didn't leave the chair's face, and for the first time Ethan saw the man falter, his certainty cracking. Ethan took a step closer, his voice low but steady. "I may not wear a suit, but I know something about leadership. My son looks at me every day, and I have to show him how to keep going even when everything feels impossible. That's leadership too. Maybe it doesn't come with boardrooms and investors, but it's real. And if you can't see that Madison is better for understanding people like me, then maybe you're the ones who've lost perspective." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then surprisingly, one of the younger board members, a woman with sharp glasses and a measured tone, leaned forward. "He's right," she said. "Authenticity is what investors crave now. A leader who can connect with people beyond her rank isn't a liability. It's an asset. Perhaps we've been looking at this the wrong way." Another board member nodded slowly, and soon the rigid wall of disapproval began to crack. Not all of them were convinced, but enough shifted that the chair realized he was losing ground. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This is reckless," he muttered, but he didn't argue further. When the meeting adjourned, Madison and Ethan walked out side by side. The hallway outside felt lighter, almost fragile in its quiet. Madison stopped, turning to him. For the first time in days, her eyes softened without fear of who might be watching. "You didn't have to speak up," she whispered. "But you did. You risked everything." Ethan shook his head. "No, Madison. You're the one who risked everything. I just told the truth." She stepped closer then, her hand brushing his cheek in a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. "The truth," she murmured, "is the only thing I want from now on." At that moment, the elevator doors opened, and Ethan's son Daniel ran out, escorted by Madison's assistant, who had been watching him during the meeting. The boy's face lit up when he saw his father. "Dad!" he shouted, barreling into his arms. Ethan caught him, lifting him high, his heart swelling. Daniel's innocent laughter echoed down the corridor, filling the sterile corporate space with a sound that was pure, unpolished joy. Madison looked at them, tears glinting in her brown eyes. She reached out, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder, and for a fleeting second, the three of them stood together like a family born not of status or wealth, but of choice and resilience. The battle wasn't over. There would still be whispers, judgments, challenges ahead, but in that moment, something fundamental had shifted. Madison had chosen authenticity over pretense, Ethan had found his voice, and Daniel had unknowingly stitched their worlds together with laughter. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel like a janitor standing on the edges of someone else's life. He felt like a man standing at the beginning of his own. In my opinion, this story is not just a fairy tale about a janitor and a millionaire CEO. It's a reminder that the most powerful changes in life often come from the most unexpected places. The father never sought fame, wealth, or recognition. All he wanted was to provide for his child. Yet his hidden talent, born out of love and struggle, revealed to the world that value is never measured by a job title or a paycheck. The millionaire CEO, despite her wealth and success, discovered something priceless: human connection, humility, and the courage to see beyond appearances. The ending is uplifting because it shows that true success comes not only from ambition, but from kindness, authenticity, and courage to follow one's heart. For me, the beauty of this story lies in its message. Every person carries a gift within them, and sometimes it takes just one moment, one act of bravery, to let that gift change lives, including their own.